She had been pronounced dead, strangled, buried in a shallow grave. Her husband grieved, the town mourned, her family gathered to say their final goodbyes. But just as the funeral was about to end, she walked in. How did a woman who was kidnapped and killed days ago walk into her own funeral? What really happened? Or was it her ghost that just appeared? Sandra George was 32 years old, smart, hardworking, and newly employed at a financial firm in town. It was the kind of job she had always wanted: steady hours, good pay, and a chance to build something for herself. Her co-workers remember her as warm, professional, and easy to talk to. But what they didn't know was that outside of work, her life was anything but stable. She had been married to David George for 6 years. On the surface, they looked like any ordinary couple, but people close to Sandra say there were cracks beneath that picture. Friends noticed how her smile had faded over the years. She wasn't as social as she used to be. She started turning down invitations. At first, they thought she was just busy. Then they began to wonder. If you find this story gripping, consider subscribing to stay updated on more true crime stories that reveal the scary and unexpected twists of real life. Sandra rarely spoke about her marriage, but those who knew her well sensed something was wrong. Her husband, David, had always been protective, but over time that protection started feeling more like control. He would question where she was, who she talked to, what time she got home. He checked her phone, monitored her social media, and when she tried to push back, the fights started. One friend recalls an afternoon when Sandra showed up at her house unexpectedly. She wasn't crying, but her hands were shaking as she stirred her tea. She admitted that David's jealousy had gotten worse. He accused her of hiding things, of lying. She tried to reassure him, but it never seemed to be enough. Then there was the turning point. Sandra had been at her new job for a few months when she met a colleague named Mark. He was in his early 40s, friendly and easygoing. They worked on a project together, exchanged work emails, and occasionally chatted during lunch. Nothing more. But to David, it was something else entirely. At first, he just made comments, offhand remarks about how much time she spent at work, how she always seemed to mention this new coworker. Then the questions became more direct. He wanted to know why she was texting so much, who she was talking to, if she was hiding something. Sandra brushed it off. She had dealt with his jealousy before, but this time it didn't go away. One night, David saw a text from Mark pop up on her phone, a simple message about a work meeting. It was all the confirmation he needed. He confronted Sandra, demanding to know what was going on. When she tried to explain, he didn't listen. Their arguments became more frequent, more intense. Sandra's friends noticed the change. She started looking over her shoulder. She stopped talking about work. She seemed afraid. But no one realized just how far David's obsession was going. At home, when Sandra wasn't around, David was searching for answers. Not in her phone, not in her emails, but in something much darker. He started looking up stories of missing people. He read about unsolved crimes. He researched life insurance policies, how claims were processed, how long someone had to be missing before they were presumed dead. One night, he asked a friend a strange question. If someone disappeared without a trace, how long would it take for people to stop looking? The friend laughed it off, thinking it was just another one of David's dramatic outbursts. But David wasn't joking. He was already making plans, and Sandra had no idea. Sandra George was always careful. She had a routine. Every morning, she parked in the same spot. Every evening, she left the office around the same time. It was a habit, one she never thought would make her an easy target. On the evening of October 14th, Sandra stayed a little later than usual. A deadline was approaching, and she wanted to finish up before heading home. At 8:42 p.m., security footage captured her walking out of the building. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't seem nervous. She was just another employee leaving for the night. But she never made it home. The last known image of Sandra showed her stepping onto the sidewalk, her phone in one hand, car keys in the other. Seconds later, she was gone. No one saw exactly what happened, but there were clues. A coworker who left minutes later remembered something strange. A dark van parked near the entrance. It hadn't been there earlier. The engine was running, but the headlights were off. He didn't think much of it at the time. Another witness, a woman walking her dog, later reported hearing something, a muffled scream, the sound of a struggle, but by the time she turned around, the street was quiet. Sandra George had vanished. The next morning, her absence raised concerns. She hadn't shown up for work. Calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. Friends reached out, but there was no response. By noon, a coworker called the police. David George answered the door when officers arrived. His reaction was immediate. He told them he had been worried all morning, that Sandra had never stayed out this late without calling. His voice was steady, but there was something unusual about his response. When detectives asked if he had received any ransom demands, his answer was chilling. "They must have killed her," he said. It was too soon to assume the worst, too soon to be that certain. Detectives noted his behavior. He didn't ask the usual questions. Where could she be? Was there any sign of her? Instead, he seemed almost resigned, almost relieved. Still, there was no evidence, no leads. Sandra had simply disappeared. But Sandra wasn't dead. She was waking up in a place she had never seen before. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of oil and dust. A single light flickered overhead. Her wrists were bound, her body weak. The last thing she remembered was the sidewalk outside her office. Then nothing. She wasn't alone. There were voices, low, angry, men arguing in the next room. She couldn't see them, but she could hear every word. "This wasn't the deal," one of them said. "She saw too much," another replied. Then a third voice cut through the noise, calm, in control. Jackson. He was the one in charge, and he had made a decision. Sandra listened as he picked up a phone and made a call. David answered on the first ring. "It's done," Jackson said. There was silence, then David spoke. "Good." Sandra felt her chest tighten. She knew that voice. Her own husband had ordered her death, and now he thought she was gone. Sandra was barely conscious. The cold air hit her face as she was dragged outside, the rough grip on her arms unrelenting. She tried to fight back, but her body was weak. Every breath was a struggle. They weren't in the warehouse anymore. She could feel the dirt beneath her, hear the rustling of trees. A more isolated location. Somewhere no one would hear her scream. The hands around her neck tightened. A sharp pain shot through her chest as she gasped for air. Her vision blurred, the world darkening. Then Jackson's voice. "Stop." The pressure on her throat eased, but the damage was done. She coughed violently, desperate for air. "We're not killing her," Jackson said, his tone firm, final. The others hesitated, one of them protesting. "That's not what we agreed on." Jackson didn't argue. He reached for his phone and dialed. David answered immediately. "It's done," Jackson said, putting the call on speaker. There was silence on the other end, then a slow exhale. "Good," David said, his voice lighter, almost relieved. Then came something unexpected. Laughter. "She deserved it," he muttered. Sandra froze. The man she had spent years with, the man she had built a life with, was celebrating her death. Jackson's expression didn't change. He let David talk. "No more fights, no more accusations," David continued. "I can finally breathe." It was the final proof. He wasn't just involved. He was the mastermind. Jackson ended the call. The other men waited for instructions. Sandra braced herself. But instead of finishing the job, Jackson pulled something from his pocket. A small recording device. "Take it," he said, tossing it onto her lap. Sandra didn't move. She didn't understand. "You're free," Jackson added. "Go home." It wasn't a joke. No tricks, no conditions. She was alive, but why? Jackson never explained. Maybe he had grown tired of killing. Maybe David had rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe for the first time he wanted to see what happened next. Whatever the reason, Sandra had a second chance. But she couldn't go home. Not yet, because as far as the world knew, she was dead. For 6 days, Sandra George was a ghost. She hid on the outskirts of town, avoiding familiar streets, familiar faces. She was bruised, weak, and terrified, but she wasn't alone. She had evidence, the recording. David's own words, the laughter, the relief, the satisfaction, it was all there. She needed to act carefully. She couldn't just walk into the police station. If David found out she was alive, he might try to finish what he started. So she made contact anonymously. A burner phone, a message to the authorities. The recording was sent. No explanations, just proof. She waited. Meanwhile, David was playing his final act. With no ransom demands, no body, and no real investigation, he told friends and family that he had accepted the truth. Sandra was gone, taken by her captors, killed and discarded. Then he did something unthinkable. He arranged a funeral. The town gathered, dressed in black. People whispered condolences. Friends hugged him, comforting the grieving husband. The church was filled with mourners. Flowers lined the altar. A closed casket stood at the front, symbolizing a loss no one could confirm. David stood by it, a tissue in hand. His eyes welled up with tears, a flawless performance. The priest spoke solemnly, the final prayers began, and then the doors creaked open. A figure stepped inside. The crowd turned. Gasps filled the room. A murmur rippled through the church. Disbelief? Horror? Sandra George was standing in the doorway. Alive. David's face went pale. His breathing grew uneven. His hands trembled. He clutched his chest. His legs buckled. And then he collapsed. But this time, there would be no escaping the consequences. Because Sandra wasn't alone. She reached into her pocket, pressed a single button on her phone, and outside, police sirens wailed. As David regained consciousness, the first thing he heard was the sound of sirens. The room was dim, and his body felt heavier than it had in days. But as his blurred vision cleared, the truth hit him hard. The police were already there, moving in swiftly. Before he could react, a pair of handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Panic took hold of him, his mouth working furiously as he stammered and tried to explain. His voice trembled, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He couldn't escape it. The recording of his cold response to Sandra's supposed death played in the room, the voices clear and damning. "Good. She deserved it," he had said, the words playing over and over, looping in a cruel final confirmation. The officers didn't need to hear more. The evidence was right there, irrefutable. There was no other explanation. The man who had once been the grieving spouse was now a prisoner, his fate sealed by his own words. His desperate attempts to protest, to explain, fell on deaf ears. Sandra, standing at the back of the room, watched as he was led away. A quiet satisfaction settled over her as she saw him taken into custody, his defiance fading with each step the officers took. But while justice had come for David, the mystery surrounding the gang leader remained. Jackson, the man who had spared Sandra's life, who had arranged her release with such cold detachment, was nowhere to be found. The authorities searched, but the trail had gone cold. No one knew where he had gone, or why he had chosen to let Sandra walk free. Was it a moment of conscience? A deliberate twist of fate? Or was it simply because he had no more use for her? His motives remained a haunting enigma, leaving everyone to wonder about the true reason behind his actions. As the police car pulled away, the reality of Sandra's survival and the unimaginable journey she had endured began to settle in. She was standing at the beginning of a new life, but one that would never be free from the shadow of what had almost been her end. The final scene unfolded in a quiet, almost eerie moment. Sandra stood alone in the dimly lit room, her eyes fixed on the coffin meant for her. The wooden box lay there, an empty shell that would never hold the body it was meant to. Her hand reached down, fingers trembling slightly as she touched the nameplate that rested on the top. Sandra George. The name she had almost lost. The name that had been sealed away with the idea of her death. With a sharp motion, she yanked the plate off. The metal clang echoed through the silent room as she held it in her hand, looking at the name now severed from its resting place. Sandra George was not meant to be buried today. She wasn't meant to become a ghost, a memory sealed within the ground. Instead, she stood here, alive, in control. In that moment, she wasn't just reclaiming her life, she was reclaiming her future. And as the camera lingered on her steady gaze, her grip tightening on the nameplate, the narration rang out in a quiet, resolute tone. She was supposed to be buried today, but instead, she's the one who buried the past. In that simple action, Sandra had done more than tear a name from a coffin. She had severed the ties to the life that almost claimed her, to the man who had betrayed her, and to the shadows of fear and manipulation that had once loomed over her. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She had become her own survivor, her own fighter, and in doing so, she had rewritten the story of her life. The past, no matter how close it had come to swallowing her, would remain buried. It was a powerful and irreversible statement, a final act of defiance against the forces that had tried to destroy her. As the days passed, David's trial unfolded, drawing intense media attention. The recordings, the undeniable proof of his actions, were played repeatedly in the courtroom. His chilling words, the casual indifference with which he spoke of his wife's death, were seared into the minds of all who heard them. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, showing that David had not only orchestrated Sandra's kidnapping, but had also coldly accepted her supposed death. His prior behavior, his increasing jealousy, his obsession with life insurance, and his dark turn toward crime painted a portrait of a man who had lost all moral compass. David's defense, however, was weak. He attempted to deny everything, claiming his words had been taken out of context, that he had been under stress. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, including some who had seen Sandra being abducted, spoke with chilling clarity about the night she disappeared. The forensic evidence corroborated Sandra's testimony. The moment of truth had arrived. Sandra, though hesitant at first, agreed to testify. Standing in front of the court, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything she had endured, she described the horror of being betrayed by the man she had once trusted. She spoke of her fear, of the violence she had experienced, and of the relief she had felt when she heard her husband's call, sealing his guilt. The courtroom was silent as she recounted the chilling moment when she realized her life had been nothing more than a plot in his twisted mind. David's fate was sealed. As the trial concluded, he was convicted on charges of attempted murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The victim of his plot had become the symbol of resilience, of overcoming the darkest forces. While justice had been served, Sandra never fully recovered from the trauma she had endured. She stayed out of the public eye for a while, choosing to rebuild her life away from the constant scrutiny. She did, however, receive support from friends, family, and even strangers who admired her strength. Sandra would never be the same person she was before that fateful day, but in the end, she emerged from the darkness stronger, having reclaimed her life and buried the past once and for all. David, now a prisoner, would face the consequences of his actions every day for the rest of his life. A reminder that justice, no matter how long it takes, will always find a way to prevail. If you found this story gripping, please consider subscribing to stay up to date on more true crime stories that reveal the chilling and unexpected twists of real life. Don't forget to like, share, and comment with your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful stories to light.